It was the early 80s, and I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would help my brother and I become better men. And to be honest, he was right. Being in the army showed me things many would never get to experience. And I'm thankful for every experience, even for the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to be fully immersed, so he chose to move us into a small neighborhood off base. We lived in a small house at the top of a very big hill in a cul-de-sac, which overlooked part of a huge zoo, and on one side there is a large cemetery. Our house was set far above the monkey habitats, about a mile or so downhill. Thick jungle was between us and those habitats. The kids and me from the neighborhood would walk through endlessly, ignoring the fact that poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II were everywhere, as well as warning signs. We were surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing being the only American family living there. The kids loved us, and we understood each other perfectly mostly. Opposite us was an older couple with a beautiful garden which surrounded their property. The woman was known as Mama Kai. The local kids were always helping out in her garden, and she would reward them with cookies and tea. She was well loved, and was so generous and kind. Everyone here was. The only downside to Mama Kai's home was that it overlooked the cemetery, which was incredibly scary. Burials don't happen very often due to Okinawa being an island. Instead, crypts which were above ground were built into the sides of the hills that make the island. The crypts are huge, made of large arcs using polished stone, which is set over a large square of the same stone, with a square also cut into the middle where the coffin is to be placed inside. Once inside, the square is attached to another piece of polished stone just inside, leaving a shelf on the outside where people would leave flowers, incense, food, and yen. Below Mama Kai's house was a hill that swooped back up into another hill opposite her house. That valley and both hills were covered with these crypts. It was quite a sight. One late afternoon, Mama Kai asked me to come visit her by myself. She had something she wanted to show me, but only I could see it. I agreed. She took me to the back part of the garden and had me sit on a carved, thick wooden bench with pictures of swords, men and fishermen on it. She wanted to tell me a story. Mama Kai then disappeared for a minute or two and returned with a tray of tea and cookies. She sat next to me and smiled, commenting on the colors of the sky as the sun began to set. She said she'd seen me, some other kids and my little brother daring each other to go down a path into the cemetery. The path from our home area down towards the cemetery had hundreds of steps. Most were cracked or broken at a sheer incline that weaved in and out of bushes. It was very dangerous, but we wanted to see how long we could walk through the crypts when night fell. Mama Kai wanted to explain why we really shouldn't. During the war, many years ago, Americans were thought to be evil, sickos that would murder innocent citizens for fun. That fear was made due to wartime propaganda that was used to encourage young men and farmers to the army to fight alongside them. But hundreds of them ran instead and had nowhere to hide or go, so ended up jumping off the cliff to avoid their enemy. I was horrified whilst listening to this. I had no idea. I was mortified. Sadness washed over me and I started to cry. The sun was setting and the sky was a deep orangey red. Mama Kai reached out and held my hand, saying it's okay, this was in the past. We must keep the story alive so we don't go back. She carried on with her story. There was a young woman who'd sacrificed her 2 children, but she ended up surviving, jumping from the cliff. She ended up in a coma for months. When she regained consciousness, she was horrified to realize she was alive and her children were not. They'd been buried in the cemetery below. It was an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend her nights and days searching that cemetery, crying. You could feel her pain and the torment of her loss. Until one day she threw herself into the ocean below the cliff, hoping she'd be reunited with her lost family. But they say she was separated from her children. She would be stuck in purgatory for eternity due to her act of suicide, subjected to eternal torture. The sun had gone now, and the cemetery drowned in darkness. The main path was dotted with lights, but unfortunately they were broken and dim, so pretty poor at illuminating the allocated areas. Mama Kai carried on. The female still wanders the cemetery, never giving up on her kids. You can still hear her crying. And then she pointed down. I didn't want to, but I looked. In the cemetery, through the darkness, there was at first a white, bright shimmer, a white figure, moving slowly, like it was shaking. It moved from side to side, as though it was searching among the crypts, and you could hear the crying. Softly to begin with, but then moans and whimpers of pain as the figure got closer. I was horrified. I wanted to run away, but Mama Kai held my hand and whispered that we were too far. We were safe as she wouldn't come up here. This is why we shouldn't go down there when it gets dark. Many don't know her story and call her White Weeper, which angers her. It's best to avoid and to pray for her. Mama Kai said she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she will find her. After that day, I never sat with Mama Kai again, and I never went down to that cemetery, not once. I did visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now, out of respect. I prayed for all the souls, asked for forgiveness, and just cried the whole time we were there. So many Japanese citizens welcomed us, told us stories, shared with us and spoke to us. My love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time in Japan, and I'd like to go back, to see if she's still there, wandering the graves, looking for her children. Hopefully one day they'll be reunited.